you know, what we do in this webinar is talk about the play and the play now. Some people I know on the call will already know this play very well. For others, they may be complete beginners and wondering whether to spend more time with it. And we hope to try and hit both of those audiences. Do use the Q&A to ask questions. It's great if you've got questions as we go along. We'll have about 20 minutes at the end for that, and the whole of our time together is scheduled to be an hour and a quarter. So I'll just give the introduction, which is that we are talking about a new series, a new edition of Shakespeare, which is generated out of extraordinary research, groundbreaking research by the team who put together great big volumes called The New Oxford Shakespeare, published by Oxford University Press. And those editors, Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boris, and Gabriel Egan, are the sort of giants on whose shoulders we are peering over. And especially, in fact, for this particular play, Henry IV, Part 1, Anna Pruitt, who was the editor of that originally. But I wanted Indira Ghose to be the person to introduce this play, really because of the work she had done up to this point. So I'm going to give her a chance to speak, but to say a little bit about that. Indira, firstly, thank you so much for coming on the webinar. Also, thank you for being part of the World's Classics Shakespeare. Do you mind saying a bit about the work and the research interests you have had in the last decade or so running up to this edition?
Not in the least, but before anyone says I haven't said thank you, I'd like to say thank you. No, joking.
Are we in full Oscar mode? We're in full Oscar mode. Let's start weeping and all those people who've helped us. Where are you first? In fact, tell us. I'm in a spring like Oxford. Where are you?
I'm in Hamburg.
Perfect.
No spring inside.
Miracle of the modern world.
Yes. No, I meant actually, sort of the White House, when you're being accused of not saying thank you. So I wanted to preempt that.
I am such a flibbertigibbet. I assumed you meant the Oscars rather than the world in flames. Yes, please do say thank you. And are you smartly dressed? I'm a fine one ever to talk about being smartly dressed, so I'm on uncertain ground there.
I'm doing my best, right? Okay. Well, yeah, I'm very interested in humor and in all its varieties in connection with Shakespeare. So the previous book, well, I've written a couple on humor. One was Shakespeare and Laughter. That was more than 10 years ago, I think. And that was more sort of a cultural history. And more recently, I did this little book called Shakespeare in Jest, which tried to draw connections between Shakespeare's humor and popular culture, like films and comedians and stand-up comedians and late night shows, and that I did during the pandemic, and was a load of fun, and and Emma reviewed it to my delight, and I hope it was a bit of fun for you as well reading it.
It really was, Indira. And one of the things that struck me about that book and was why I wanted to follow up with you in this context was, I think lots of people have said in a throwaway sort of way, oh, perhaps Shakespeare's clowns were more like modern stand-up, or perhaps the atmosphere in Shakespeare's theatre was more like a comedy club. There was more heckling or something like that. But I don't think anybody had sort of thought more to say thought more seriously with that premise makes it immediately sound not fun, which is one of the great problems of talking about laughter and comedy, isn't it? That you can really sort of kill the thing that you love. But I don't think anybody had really thought, well, how does timing and audience interaction and the pacing of a joke or a story or something, how do masters and masters of both men and women in the modern period do that, and what could we learn from it? And I thought that was a brilliant set of insights.
Thank you. Well,
But the play we're talking about is
hmm.
a history play, isn't it? Or let's think a bit about
Yes,
what that
I think,
connection
I
is, in
mean,
case people think we've missed we've missed a step.
I mean, there's plenty of, comic material in Shakespeare's comedies. Obviously, there's, lots of clowns and witty women and what have you. There are funny moments, dark humor in the tragedies. But strangely enough, the funniest character in Shakespeare is in a history play, in this history play, the character of Falstaff, who's almost a standalone monument of fun and humor and comic entertainment and wit and he's made his way into a history play. I'm not sure Shakespeare quite knew to what dimension he would grow. That there's this theory that he had to kill him off at some point because he was just taking over, even though we were promised at the end of Henry the Fourth Part Two that Falstaff would come back, but he didn't. In Henry the Fifth. We just hear about the death of Falstaff. He does come back actually in The Merry Wives of Windsor, which according to the latest according to Melchiori, was probably written after Henry the Fourth Part Two, in around 1600. But I'm not too fond of Falstaff in Merry Wives. It's the wives who are far wittier than him. He's a bit sort of a washed up comic figure. But it's in this play and in part one where he really is this embodiment of fun. He's comic both in as a character. His unflappability, you can never. He's never wrong-footed, even if you trip him up, he knows how to extricate himself from a tight spot, and that's just hilarious to watch. There's comedy on the level of the jests, of the pranks that are played, and seeing him get out of tight spots like Gad's Hill, like the play within the play extempore, which is also sort of an extended joke. And then there's, of course, his wit, which is what this play is. Probably the language of the play is richest in less in its verse than in its prose and in its comic prose, because it's so brilliantly inventive. Should I just go on?
No, well, I mean, I would love you to go on, but I'm just going to. There's so much already in what you've said. Yeah. Now, so I was just thinking. So Shakespeare has written some other history plays by this point in his career. He's written the plays we tend to call early ones, the Henry VI plays, probably in some complicated combination with other writers, we seem to now think. Richard III. And then I was thinking about Richard II as a play which seems, which this one follows on from in sort of historical sequence. That's a play entirely in verse, isn't it? And almost without humor. I mean, there is always wit in Shakespeare, but there's no funny character. There's no scene really, perhaps apart from the very end when O'Mel's
Yes, that.
parents sort of plead for him, but there's not really any wit in that. So that's already making me think that history plays in Shakespeare's hands vary widely in terms of their tone or even the language that they're in. So could you say a bit more about prose, maybe? What's why is there so much prose, or how does Shakespeare use the prose in Henry
Well,
the?
Well, as you said, Richard II, even though we count it as the first of the second tetralogy, is so completely different in tone to this play. There's all that sense of chivalry and the background of a divine the divine right of kings, the divinity that doth hedge a king and all that. And in this play, this seems to me radically modern in the sense of modernity has really hit home. Modern in a number of ways. You said the language. A lot of it is so anachronistic. I mean, for us, it's the past, but for the people at the time, all the scenes in Eastcheap, they were like popular culture for us today. That was set in locales that were familiar, that at least Londoners would be familiar with the tavern culture and the layabouts and the low life, the scroungers with whom Hal spends his time. They seemed like like contemporaries. And the verse is, of course, it's not the way people would speak at the time. I mean, Falstaff's prose is, sorry, not the verse, the language. The Falstaff's prose is very clever and very elaborate. And yet the feel is far less ceremonious than sort of the ornate language in Richard II. We have a gardener, but even he speaks in sort of elevated, high-flown verse, and yeah, that's one of the things that I find so very different about this play, the modernity. It's making fun. I mean, Falstaff is also, he's not only witty in himself, as he tells us, but also the cause of wit for others. That is, he's a parody. And he's a parody of something that people would have been familiar with in everyday life, not a historical figure or something, but Puritans. Puritans were, all around. And I mean, it wasn't the first stage Puritan, but when probably people would have laughed far more when they heard his jokes about using the jargon that was familiar from the godly things, like to say the most absurd things like stealing. He defends stealing as I'm working in my vocation. Now, my vocation was a sort of a phrase that Puritans would bandy about, but they meant doing an honest living and not stealing for a livelihood. And so there's the jokes about Puritans in that Falstaff makes, and then the fact that he was probably something that we've only realized, not that, quite recently, thanks to some really clever critics like Christian Poole, that as a figure, he was a parody of a Puritan. And it seems counterintuitive to us because we think surely Puritans are sort of killjoys, Malvolio, that type. But there was a range of them, and stage Puritans were above all hypocritical. That is, they'd talk about being virtuous, but they'd live quite differently. And that's, of course, Falstaff, as greedy and lecherous as it gets, but constantly talking about he'll repent and he'll reform his life. And he's actually more, done hard by than anything else. He's a victim of others' evil doing. So yeah, all that makes it so very contemporary and modern. Modern for the audiences at the time, and for us, modern in the sense that there are other elements which I find modern, and that is, I think, all these theories about divine kingship go out of the window. What we see there is kings who, and that's why I think Machiavelli is a strong influence. Rulers, one is a usurper, the other is a son of a usurper, who have to sort of earn their position. It's not as if it's their divine right. They have to achieve kingship. Hal has to work in this play to achieve what he gets at the actually at the end of of part 2. But that's a very modern way of seeing things. This or a Renaissance way, but that's still with us. The idea that it's not and what you are, not what you are by birth, but what you do, what you make of yourself.
So there's lots of ways that Hal, I love that idea that Hal is in a modern tavern world, that he's sort of slipped out of a um, serious history play into a sort of raucous city comedy, and he's just, slipped out of one grand door in the stateroom and ended up in the tap room of in a tavern. And that he's shifted between worlds. It's one of the things I think is so fabulous about this play, that we begin with this very somber verse scene, don't we, about how terrible it is to be a king, and how it's all sort of going bit belly up for Henry, and he has not got a calm kingdom at all. Um, and then we move to this extraordinarily energetic, disrespectful, um, cheerful prose. I love it that uh, doesn't Falstaff says, what time is it, doesn't he, or something, and Hal says, what does it matter to you, you lazy thing, you never, it's a different world run, but rules with different um by different frameworks and different sorts of moralities, and that seems very attractive. I suppose one of the things you said a few minutes ago that I was really struck by was reminding us that perhaps Shakespeare invents in Falstaff a character who is sort of out of scale. I mean, all the jokes about Falstaff are about his physical bulk, aren't they? But that somehow conceptually he's out of scale with the play that he is in, because the sort of the experience of watching this play or thinking about it is usually that we would much prefer, like Hal, to be in the tavern
Yeah.
than with the king. It's so boring, isn't it? And so gloomy, whereas it's kind of fun. And I mean, do you feel there are ways the play is pulling into directions? There's obviously that prodigal son idea, isn't there? And
Mhm.
Hal is going to have to leave all this behind, and he's going to have to become the king that he is um, sort of destined to be. But um, a kind of Augustinian, make me virtuous, but not yet. That it's more fun not to be. Do you feel it's pulling in those two directions? I often do, I think, when I'm working
I
with it.
think you're completely right. I mean, one of the reasons why Falstaff is such fun to be with is because, of course, there's this anarchic streak of with him, right? He's a jester. He's all play, immediate gratification, perpetual play, no thought of growing up, responsibility, norms, or anything of that kind, which is what I think appeals to everyone on a, yeah, sort of even on a vicarious level, because we don't love to live. It's I think that's what he dangles in front of Hal, a sort of a world in which you just don't need to grow up. You don't need to get away from that. You can just live from day to day in a perpetual whirl of fun. And uh, maybe that's what makes him so seductive, for such seductive company for Hal. But what I wanted to say earlier about Falstaff being such an embodiment of humor and fun. There's also something else very interesting going on for a history play, and that's this double act, actually. I mean, Hal is pretty good as in their crosstalk. There is they they're obviously playing games with each other. They have this joking relationship, which is quite remarkable. It's not just sort of the low life characters who make jokes at the side, or Falstaff making jokes at the side. It's Hal and Falstaff engaging in games until it comes to the battle, and then Hal has no time for jokes anymore. Falstaff would go on. Um, And that I think is quite remarkable as well. So I think that's also part. If we see the play as sort of the education of a prince, it's clear that Hal is also picking up things. He's learning things, whether it's the demotic touch or it's just wit in being clever. I mean, Hal goes on to become the king with this, with this rhetorical gift. And part of it is surely sort of, through his training with Falstaff. So I think there's this joking relationship, this double act between the two of them, in which Hal is not just sort of the straight man, but there's this comic patter between the two of them for at least for the first half of the play, which I think is quite brilliant and remarkable.
It's a great question about the play, isn't it? Particularly in performance, about Hal, whether Hal and Falstaff have a reciprocal relationship, an equal relationship. Whether, I mean, the Falstaff you have talked about so far is a very jovial, likable, sort of scallywag or rogue. I mean, not a wicked, a vice character in the sense that important technical sense of the vice in a drama, rather than vicious, being a bad influence, as everyone says he is in the play. What do you think of those readings or those performances which make him a more difficult, self-interested, uh, sort of disreputable, negative figure rather than a figure of fun? Do you feel, are they missing something about the spirit of the play?
I think actually he's both. So I don't think there's a contradiction in terms in being a lovable rogue and someone who's purely self-interested and is clearly out to exploit everyone around him, including Hal. What I don't think, there is a vicious streak, but he's not a malicious jester like Richard the Third, sorry. There's something different, but there is, as I said, this anarchic streak, which means he's like he loves throwing a wrench into the works. He's about destroying. There's a destructive element in his gesture, in humor very often. And I think he's the embodiment of that. And we see less pleasant sides to him, even in this play. Of course, in Henry the Fourth Part 2, the more unsavory elements come to the fore. But even here, when he's canvassing all these or impressing, that's the word, all these men to be soldiers in the civil wars, he makes it quite clear that, firstly, that he's a corrupt, probably quite a few. There were quite a few satirical texts about these corrupt Elizabethan captains or army people who'd go around taking bribes and only impress those who really had those who had really no way of escaping their grip. And he says quite clearly, these are all just food for powder. They're good enough to be cannon fodder. And that's what he tells us at Shrewsbury as well. That's exactly what's happened to them. That they've all been wiped out. So he's rid of them. But that's also an element in Falstaff. He's completely not only this touch of the anarchic and the wrecking ball element of humor, but also he's completely self-interested and egoistical. It's about in the introduction I said he was in a way an embodiment of sort of radical individualism. He's out for his own for what's good for him. And that's all that counts. And even in his relationship with Hal, it's not as if, there's this, yes, they're having great fun together, but I find there's always a sense of a sort of muted aggression between the two of them. Also on Hal's part, Hal makes so many jokes, for instance, about hanging and the kind of thing that would happen to thieves. And every time when Falstaff tries to sort of pin him down to make a commitment that when he's king, he won't sort of let it out on his former low life group of friends. He never makes that commitment. He never gets that. Falstaff never gets that commitment from.
Yes, in fact, quite the opposite, doesn't he? We
Yeah.
get that ominous scene. Uh, yeah, that where Hal says he would more well ambiguously, but seems to say that he will hang Falstaff as a thief. I mean, you could ask the same question. I could ask the same question, couldn't I, about Hal? I mean, one version of this question is Falstaff exploiting Hal? And
Mhm.
the other might be, is Hal exploiting Falstaff? I mean, I'm thinking about that very powerful argument of Stephen Greenblatt's that precisely what Hal learns in among these sort of regular people is how to be a more sort of brilliantly, ruthlessly repressive king. He knows how to he knows how to hand. He hasn't been in this sort of shut away solely in the royal palace. He's learnt who his people are, and he will use that to suppress them, really, as a tyrannical monarch. And I was thinking about, I mean, at the end of that scene. So we were just talking about Act One and how it moves from the verse of the court. So shaken as we are, so one with care. It's all troubled, and then to this who cares what time it is kind of thing. But then I was just thinking about Hal's soliloquy at the end of that scene. So he the tavern sort of fades away. He's left alone on stage. He goes back to verse, doesn't he? Which we've not heard him speak. Um, I mean, could you say a bit about that speech then and what he is? How you feel that affects our sense of the relationship between the two of them.
I think maybe that's one of the big changes that Shakespeare makes to his sources. I mean, he had a variety of sources from Holinshed, the idea that, or the stories about the madcap prince who then undergoes a change of heart. That wasn't Shakespeare's invention. And then, of course, we have this play, The Famous Victories of Henry V, which was probably 10 years old by this time, but was still being revived and probably shaped people's view of the prince. So they knew that this was a prince who had, who was a prodigal in his youth, but then went on to become this great king Henry V. But in all other versions, he has this sudden change of heart. He reforms, and this is also the idea that in prodigal literature, which the cheap market for cheap print would have been flooded with prodigal stories of people who through the operation of grace, the shades fall from their eyes, and they reform. And that's not the way it is in Shakespeare's play. We have, it seems to me, at least that's the way I would read the soliloquy. We have someone who, at the end of this scene, where as you described, that they're joshing with each other and fooling around, and then he's alone on stage, and he turns to us, and it seems to me, in a very sort of calculated way, he says, "I know you all, including us." The audience. I know it's not always played that way. Sometimes it's just he's addressing the tavern, the now empty tavern. But whichever, he's clearly distancing himself from his companions, and he tells us this is this is just a performance I'm putting on. I'm just play acting. This is not really who I am. And he uses this analogy of the sun, which was, of course, the standard image for kingship. And he says, like when the sun is covered up by dark clouds, and then at some point deigns to reappear, then the sun shows himself in greater glory than if he had been shining the whole time. And in the same way, my lifestyle here, my the prodigality with which I'm associated is something I'm going to drop this whole facade at the opportune moment. And the reason why I'm doing this is because then I will shine in even greater glory and be even more appreciated. So there's a
That's very
calculation.
chilling, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
just as you've read it, I mean, that seems um the whole, obviously those prodigal son stories, that biblical story about the young man who goes and takes half his inheritance and goes to spend it all, and comes back uh begging for just a job in the looking after the pigs, doesn't he? And the father takes him in and says, we're so glad to have you back. And the brother, who's been good all the time, says, well, not much reward for me. That was a great Elizabethan parable, wasn't it? They seem to have really, really loved that. But what's always struck me about the prodigal son is he did all the bits of it in good faith, or however wrong they were. He went off with his inheritance and enjoyed himself, and he wasn't just doing that in order to come back, whereas Hal is doing it, as you've described, in a very, very strategic way,
Well,
isn't he?
that's
To
what it
say,
seems to me.
yeah,
Yes, it's read in different. Some say that actually this is apologetic, or he's just informing us. But to me, it doesn't make sense because the audience would have known that he'd be reformed at some point. It's not. He doesn't need to inform them. They'd be familiar with the story. It's
mm,
just the way he does it that is so striking.
mm.
It seems to me. Yeah. I think there's this streak of calculation clearly in Hal. So it's a good question who's exploiting whom or whether they don't deserve each other. And
Yeah, they've actually found each other. They're both self-interested, and perhaps they both know that about the other, or perhaps, I mean, it's so interesting how that relationship has been played in performances of the play, and then in sort of spin-off things, like I was thinking about Gus Van Sant's sort of queer version of it in My Own Private Idaho, um, and other takes on that. I was reading the novel by Alan Bratton called Henry.
yeah, I
Henry,
heard about that.
have you?
Yes.
Yeah, that's also very interesting. But I mean, both those spin-offs pick up the sort of bromance, I suppose. I mean, they queer that bromance, but they identify that this is um, a very intimate, uh, if in certain ways slightly sleazy relationship between these two men that Hal is going to have to leave behind, and they sort of tell that story in some slightly different ways. So we've spent a long time on Falstaff, and that seems in a way a sort of microcosm of the play itself. That um, I mean, if anybody doesn't know what the play is about, they won't have got very much sense of what it's about from what we've been talking, except that it's about Falstaff. And perhaps that's actually, I mean, perhaps that's truer, um, sort of truer than we know, that the ostensible historical structure where the king is under threat from these various groups of noblemen. They come to this battle at Shrewsbury, which looks as if it's going to be um, absolutely consequential. But in fact, although the king, aided by the prince, Prince Henry, his son, who has sort of got back on message, It's a brief lull, really, isn't it? We end the play with a sense there's going to be more, even though they've won that battle. There's still more to come, and of course we've got the sequel of part two, which you've already mentioned. Do you feel when you were working on this play on its own, which is of course how people would have experienced it if they bought, an edition of it in 1598 or 1600 or whatever, and probably how they would have experienced it if they'd gone to the theatre. They would have seen this standalone play. But did you feel working on it now that it needs to be seen as part of that bigger sequence of plays, or in connection at least with part two, or does it work on its own?
I think it works on its own, to be honest. But of course, it's been staged quite often as a sequence in our century. Apparently, not so much in the past, where it was often, well, it was Falstaff's play, and it was often called by the, something we'll no doubt touch upon at some point. They called Oldcastle very much longer than after the name had been changed, and I think like in the where is that in um, the Beaumont and Fletcher Folio. There's one of those laudatory verses in 1640 or something. It says, "This is," and when Falstaff comes to the, and when Falstaff stage, then the cracking of nuts ceases because everyone is riveted.
Mm.
And then there were drolls during the interregnum when the theatre was closed down, which was just people like Falstaff and Mistress Quickly, and so I think it works on its own just as much as it's enriched by the entire sequence. But it does work on its own, it seems to me.
What do you think? I mean, my pet theory, which I'm going to use the privilege of ostensibly chairing this to put out, is I think Shakespeare had an idea there would be one sequel that would take us from where we end part one
Yeah.
to the Battle of Agincourt. I don't think he thought there would be two at that point. I don't think he thought there would be both the play we now call Henry the Fourth Part Two and Henry the Fifth, because I mean, I won't be saying this when we get to these plays in our long, long odyssey through Shakespeare, but I'm going to say it now. There isn't really enough story in either of those plays. They'd make one good one between them, as my grandmother used to say about her couples who she didn't like. So they make one good one between them. And it's as if the material is being kind of padded out. I mean, the metaphors, like Falstaff, it's hard to avoid them. Um, so what happens then is we get another version of the same play almost, don't we? Part two
Sort of like Die
doesn't
Hard.
really take us all that much further. It has a bit of a reprise of what was so fun about part one. And I suppose, like many sequels, it has generally not been thought to be quite as successful. You already suggested that Falstaff is perhaps morally is less fun and more morally dubious in the second play than he is here. Um,
Well,
yeah, so maybe the
I mean,
sequel is the
what would support your theory is, of course, the famous victories, because that has it all three of them packed into one play. It starts off with what we see as part one. It goes on to a part two, and ends up in Agincourt. So
yeah.
it has that's all packed into one play. Um, so that would support your theory. What is true is apparently that in the sources, like in Holinshed, they do mention that after Shrewsbury, the historical Hal did have a sort of relapse.
Hmm.
So it wasn't just an invention of Shakespeare's to spin it out, but
Yeah.
that he'd have sources which to fall back on about this idea of, okay, that was
Yeah.
a one-off, or not a one-off, but that was a milestone. But then the prince relapses into his old habits, and before it comes to the death of the king, he needs to go through a. But still, that's an interesting theory, because part two is yes, it's also not so funny. I mean, there's the one jest which is pretty. Yeah, it's not that fun. Where Hal and Poins dress up as what do you call it? Not waiters, but what's the word?
Drawers, aren't they?
Yeah, drawers,
Yeah,
exactly.
drawers, whatever
And
whatever they are. Quite, yes. I
as
can see I'm going to have to bone up a bit on part two by the time we come round to it, but we're not going to get to part two for quite a long time in this webinar series, I don't think. No, that's interesting that it isn't. It hasn't been thought to be as successful, and it's always been it's a really interesting question whether we have got Henry the Fourth and then Henry the Fourth Part Two, which is how the plays are in single volume publication in the so-called quarto publication of the end of the 16th century, or whether it is Henry the Fourth Part One and then Henry the Fourth Part Two, which is what the first folio gives us in 1623. So the folio suggests this is a two-part play split in the middle because there's so much going on, whereas to me the quarto publication suggests here's a very successful play and here's, you know, Lethal Weapon 2, as it were, or you know, to think about modern sequels. Yeah. Shall we talk a little bit though about the sort of historical politics of the play, of the representation of King Henry himself, or any of that? Is there any of that material that you want to bring forward to the discussion? As I say, like Hal, we have pretty much ignored that, haven't we? And we've headed to the tavern. But I wonder what you think of. I mean, we haven't mentioned, for example, Hotspur, who's another. If Falstaff represents one view of how you might behave, Hotspur, I suppose, is at the other end of the kind of behavioral spectrum. And none of that's a question, Indira, but you can pick through any bit of that you would like to talk
well,
about.
I think that would sort of reinforce this feeling of modernity, because Hotspur is really, he's mired in the past. He's a relic. He's certainly charismatic, and on the quarto it says this is a play about Henry the Fourth. And I mean, you'll know the exact wording about the battle of the king with Hotspur at Shrewsbury, and about what's it, the wit, or
The humorous conceits or something, is it? Yes. Yeah.
Falstaff. So Falstaff certainly plays a role, but plays an important role. But I think more as not only as a foil for the prince, and a foil for Falstaff, because remember, he has this dramatic speech about honor, which is the exact opposite of what Falstaff says about honor, right? It's to pluck bright honor from the moon, or and he stands for ideals of chivalry and honor in the most almost in a parodic sense. And you have this one speech of his right at the beginning, that I think it's the third scene, right, when he comes to court, and the king accuses him and says, "Why haven't you handed over your prisoners?" And his first impulse is to apologize and make excuses for himself. And he says, "There came this courtier, the spruce and neat courtier, who was always sniffing at his snuff box, and lecturing me about practices of war." And this was obviously the kind of person he hates. Like, he hates mincing poetry. It's all the embodiment of the new type of nobility that Hotspur wants to have nothing to do with, and that's the courtier. Aristocracy. So historically, you could say aristocrats not at this point, but in Shakespeare's time, certainly, were no longer mainly defined as warriors, but as courtiers, and that's why the Shakespeare's world was sort of soaked in nostalgia for this medieval world of chivalry. They had these jousting matches where they'd all dress up as knights in armor. That's not the way they actually carried out war anymore, but it was something that would appeal to it sort of it appealed to some kind of nostalgia. So for me, the Hotspur sort of reinforces this feeling that we have now moved into a different world historically, into a world in which ideas of chivalry no longer play the role they did in the past.
Yeah, and it's interesting to link that with what you said about modernity, and you mentioned Machiavelli, the sense of the play, perhaps one of the ways the play has continued to be so popular and to speak to these different periods of time is the sense of an era shifting somehow,
Mhm.
of a sort of break in time in some way. Yeah, I'm thinking again now about, does it matter what time it is? You know, there is something happening about a bigger shift, not just what hour it is, but a bigger, more epochal shift of different allegiances and so on. Indira, as usual, we haven't got as much time. We seem to have loads of time, and then there isn't as much time as I think. But I'm just going to share. I've made one slide about the scene that we talked about, just so we can talk just with a tiny bit more detail, just for a few minutes about one aspect of the play. And this is the Battle of Shrewsbury that we've been talking about. So let me just find where we are. Yeah, this is it. Is that right? Do we have that as a play from start? So that would
Yeah.
just, yeah, perfect. So we've just got this opening from Shrewsbury, which I wanted actually to give your page opening so people can get a sense what these editions are like. The notes are, as you see, sort of glossary notes on the page, but not. We haven't got any in this edition. We don't have any of those pages like you get in some editions where there's 2 lines of the play and then 95 lines of explaining the play. We want the play to move along on the page a bit here. But I wanted to start. I want you to talk about this, Indira, but this is my favorite stage direction, I think, probably in all Shakespeare. Falstaff riseth up. It always seems more to me than he gets up or stands up. There's something so um sort of almost sort of magical, or I think it make me think of those ideas that Falstaff is somehow the green man of the sort of summer representation of spring or summer or something, the sort of the thing that can't be killed, the principle of life or something. And I always feel that in that Riseth Up. But tell us a bit about this speech, this wonderful speech of his.
Well, for me, it's more sort of a jack in the box. It's this classic strategy, a comic strategy of someone who seems to be dead, then sort of resurrecting from the dead. It's in upteen farces where you have people who are corpses rising up and saying, I'm not dead," and maybe for a moment the spectators thought he was really dead when he was lying there, and then up, he's just indestructible. It's like you think of the Green Man. I thought of a jester. A
Yeah.
jester never dies. He's sort of indestructible, like the Vice. He goes off in disgrace at the end of every medieval play, and back he is in the next.
Back he comes, yeah. So
And
we've
then
had this extraordinary sort of farewell from Hal, seemingly to the dead Falstaff, and then Hal leaves and Falstaff jumps up, as you say. Yeah, the Jack in the Box is a nice figure.
Yeah, and then there's this there are all these jokes around this word counterfeit, which is um, which is a bit of a running gag or in this play, because counterfeit, of course, had many meanings. There's the commercial meaning, like it's a forgery, or it was also a word used for, I mean, counterfeit as imitation, for actors, for acting, for. So basically, it's like a little meta theatrical speech there, where he's saying, I'm not an actor, I'm no counterfeit, I lie, which is exactly. So you had this actor standing up and saying, I'm not an actor, I'm lying. And it's funny on many levels, because he says, I'm no counterfeit, meaning I'm not the representation of any historical night. I'm an actor, which is also true. And then when he goes on to say, a completely absurd way of thinking, just turning it around, he said the real counterfeits are the corpses, because hey, it's gone for me, but
Come back.
yeah. So the corpses are real counterfeits, because they're just imitations of the living. I mean, what a way to see a corpse. So they're the true counterfeits, the true fakes. But if I'm just to counterfeit dying, like he was doing, or you could say to act as a dying person, which is what he's also doing, is not a counterfeit, but actually the true and perfect image of life, which is in a nutshell a defense of the theater, saying, actually, this is the truest life. Faking things is the truest life. You can hardly get better than that. So he smuggles into the speech of this medieval knight a defense of the theater, and that's hilarious. And then
Oh, that's amazing. That's a brilliant thing to maybe we'll finish on that. And it's so great. Just what you've explained there, I think, or begun to explain about that speech. One thing it does as well is to torpedo what we sometimes lazily say, that somehow prose is more sort of simple or relaxed than verse. And I think you've begun to show us this is a really densely sort of poetic in the terms of punning on different meanings, sort of complex set of thoughts. And it makes, I think it also makes us rethink, why does Shakespeare use prose, and how does he use it in these seriously comic ways. Perfect. I'm just going to unshare now, and we're going to move, Indira, that's been just fabulous, but let's move to some questions. We are about 20 minutes, which is what we hoped for. And we've got a couple of questions which are effectively about genre, the genre of a history play. What are the main features of a genre? And then another question from Jan Erik, asking about the comedies as a separate series. So maybe if I have a first go at the genre, and you maybe think a little bit about the history, what different meanings of the history play. So Jan Erik, one of the ways we've got Shakespeare, one of the major ways that Shakespeare has been transmitted to us, is through this book of collected plays called the First Folio, which comes out posthumously in 1623. So it's not Shakespeare's own organization necessarily that has shaped it. But what's important about that book is it's divided into three genres: comedies, histories, and tragedies. And there are roughly equal numbers of plays in each, sort of 12 or 13. And that has had a very long shadow over the ways that we've understood, we've begun to group Shakespeare's plays. And obviously there are lots of different ways you could do that, but nevertheless, I think scholars have often continued to operate within those categories. So when people talk about comedies, they're talking largely about that group of plays which are called comedies. When they're talking about tragedies, about the tragedies. But histories is a less in some ways a less self-evident genre, because it seems to be a genre based not on the shape of the story, which you could say comedy and tragedy are effectively shape genres. Where do we start and where do we finish? That's clearly an idea in history, but the point about the history in Shakespeare's hand seems to be that it doesn't really finish, or it finishes in a contingent way, but the assumption of the genre is that in some form it continues. That's not necessarily the feeling that we get from either Shakespeare's comedies or tragedies, I would say. So, Indira, do you want to say a bit more about history?
I think you're completely right. This open-endedness is one of the features. I'd just like to add that what we talk about as histories are English medieval history. Shakespeare's written, plenty of stuff about Roman history or Greek history or what have you. But that's not what's usually in the category of the history plays. What else? Maybe
I've got some follow-up on this, actually. Paul has reminded us of Polonius's tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral, pastoral, comical. And I think Paul is suggesting that maybe scholarship's too obsessed with these genres from the folio. I don't think I think that that's necessarily the case, but it definitely has been a way, a sort of over a kind of umbrella to say this is sort of um, what these are some basic divisions, I suppose, between Shakespeare's plays. In some ways, comedy has been the most difficult one to define, because the comedies seem, in lots of ways, to be more various, to put quite a lot of strain on the idea of a happy ending, maybe, or of humor, or various sorts of constituent parts. We've got a couple of people who are thinking about this play in relation to modern ideas. One thinking about Falstaff as a Boris Johnson type figure. Charming, not intelligent, not, sorry, charming, this is Angela, charming, not unintelligent, cowardly, fat, hypocritical, Epicurean, fluent. Why do some of us enjoy the one and not the other? Is it just the historical distance? So that's kind of interesting model, but Boris Johnson, a Shakespearean at the moment, just slightly Monkey, isn't it? We haven't yet had Boris's book on Shakespeare, but perhaps by the time people watching this in the future, we will have done. And also sort of connected to that, maybe the extent that the sort of allure I think John is thinking about here of seeing the real lives of public figures, or the idea that the royal figure who is more human, sort of behind the scenes, is very attractive to us. We want leaders to be human, charismatic, in touch with pleasure. I'm thinking about, says John, our enduring obsession with Princess Diana in that regard. So that's interesting. I mean, do you feel when you're thinking about this play, Indira, that it's you talked about it being modern? Do you think of it as having connections with sort of celebrity culture, or particularly 20th or 21st century ways of understanding our relation to ruling figures, or whatever?
Um, Not really, I must admit. I thought modernity more in the sense of what's different, what's new with the early modern age,
Mm,
this which still shapes us today. But I didn't think in terms of celebrity culture or
mm,
no, I can't really see a connection there. I'd have to think about it. I'm
mm.
sure that makes a lot
It's
of sense.
interesting, isn't it, that sense of I'm thinking about again, I'm sort of thinking back in a way to your idea about what Hal is learning through this process and whether some of what he is learning will make him into a better king. And there are ways. I wonder what it seemed like then. I've just been reading a book about Queen Elizabeth II by Craig Brown called Voyages Around the Queen or something. And I've been reading the chapter which was about people who are not aficionados of the British royal family will find this extremely strange. But there was a period in the late 1980s when the Queen was persuaded that her children ought to be on a television program called It's a Knockout, where they would be seen to be good sports and sort of making fools of themselves, and that this would be rather good for their slightly standoffish or stuffy image. And in fact, I think that the general consensus about that was that actually, if if they, the modern royal family, that's to say, are not stuffy and rather distant, kind of why are they the royal family, and that it's slightly backfired. And there are certainly points about like that, aren't there, where people say, I think someone says about the performance of Henry VIII, that it's not very good to see, for people to see these sort of kings making fools of themselves. It sort of it affects how respectful people feel about real monarchs, you know, back perhaps to your counterfeit. Um, uh, yeah, so that's all really interesting. And Nick has asked about celebrity PR strategy. I mean, you could see Hal's speech that you described, um, how to manage you know, about being the son that doth permit the base contagion smother up his glory from the world. That that's a PR strategy of saying, you know, don't be seen, don't make people tired of you, manipulate your image so that when you appear, you will be, um, you know, everybody will be glad to see you.
That's brilliant. I should have thought of that. Of course, that's the link, the image management element that we find already with the father and the son. I mean, the king is just as savvy and just as aware of how he appears
Yeah.
as is Hal, and that's of course an element that we'd find in today's politicians and famous people. So it was me who was who.
Mm.
You're quite right, or whoever that the person was.
Yeah, that was Nick. Thanks,
Yeah.
thanks, Nick. There's a couple of other points that I want to take, and there's still time, I think, if anybody wants to put a question in. Um, Back to Angela, and Angela's reminded us of something we haven't talked about at all, which is Hotspur's wife, Kate. Hotspur has a wife who loved him, says Angela, which is a contrast to the Lancastrian kings. And you're absolutely right, Angela. But it also reminded me that we haven't we've you know, I've used the word bromance. We've talked as if this is all about relationships between men, fathers and sons, rivals, friends, drinking companions, quarreling noblemen, and so on. What role, what do you think, if any, there is the significance of women in this play, Indira?
Well, I do think, obviously, or not obviously, but they have very small parts, but those are quite remarkable. I mean, they leave a mark on the play. You can hardly imagine the play without Hotspur's wife, without Mistress Quickly, without the Welsh, the daughter of Glendower. Her name escapes me,
I
but
don't think we know her name, do we? I think she is just the lady.
the lady, the
Lady
Welsh.
speaks in Welsh. The lady sings in Welsh.
That
Yes.
lady sings in Welsh. I mean, these are memorable, moments of the play, and I think they even have a deeper, it's not just that sort of indelible in the experience of watching, but I think in part in sort of Shakespeare's larger sort of pattern is and that's why this play is so remarkable. You really get the feeling of different views and different worlds all playing out at the same time. It's not just politics is not just, or history being made is not just by kings and what happens at court, but histories of, lots of different people at different levels.
Mm,
And the women play a part there. There's the domestic, the domestic angle, which Lady Percy represents, and the romance and the sheer lyricism of that
mm,
Welsh scene,
mm,
which even Hotspur falls under the spell of it, even though he mocks this mincing poetry and so on. But falls under the spell like all of us when she sings this ravishing song, and that's the way it's presented to us.
mm,
And then there's Mistress Quickly, who stands her own with Falstaff. And
mm,
so I think the female roles, they're small, no doubt about it,
mm,
but they're important
mm.
in the play. They do play a
Yes, and that if we look at how Shakespeare uses his sources, they're all added, aren't they? So they're there for a purpose. Yeah, I'm glad Angela pointed us to look at that. And Mark has asked about Glendower, and I was just thinking as you spoke there about the Welsh. There is one of the ways this play seems quite prescient is it is about a distinctly disunited kingdom,
Mhm.
isn't it? And that it's falling apart um, into the nations of Wales and Scotland and England to some extent. There's a split. The split that the challenge to Henry IV is also the challenge of the nations of Britain, which is a something which hasn't gone away.
And some critics see Glendower as actually a coded reference to Ireland and the Lord Tyrone, and a completely different scenario, but reinforcing what you're saying about the split in the nation.
Hmm. And I suppose related to that, actually, Zen has asked, do we think that this play or the history plays in general have a role in Elizabethan Jacobean propaganda? So that's a really interesting question, isn't it? I suppose it maybe arises from that old idea of EMW Tilliard's about the Tudor myth. And Tilliard writing, I always think, sort of relevantly during the Second World War, wants presumably wants to feel everything is going to be all right, and feels that actually about the history plays too, as well as about the historical moment, and that these are all plays which fundamentally, however much they depict disorder and overthrow and uh, chaos, they really are all about the um, inevitability and wonderfulness of the Tudors. That's had a bit of a bashing as a model for as an explanation for the politics of the history plays. What do you think about them as propaganda or as participating in the politics of Shakespeare's own day?
Well, I don't think that really sort of Tilliard's views are really borne out by the plays, because even Henry V, I mean, it ends on the note, yes, all these glorious victories that he achieved were squandered in within a generation. So much for like creating a legacy. And the sense of the making of a nation. I think what is true is you do have a sense of a nation in these plays. That is true. That probably historical sort of more the sense of that it wasn't just different places in England, but sort of they're sort of more united there's more of a sense of a nation in the place. But propaganda, I'm not so sure.
Wonderful. I think that's probably as many questions as we can take. So I've got one last one for you, Indira, which is if somebody wants to follow up from the conversation that we've been having, obviously they should look at your introduction to the Oxford World's Classics. Is there anything else on or around this play, a film or an essay or a mention in a book or something that you would recommend?
Well, of course, there have been marvelous productions which are also available on film. I mean, Greg Doran's with Anthony Sher as Falstaff, or the Hollow Crown. That series was brilliant. My personal favorite is, even though it's not, it doesn't have Shakespeare's language, is really the Gus Van Sant's.
My own private Idaho.
My Own Private Idaho, because that captures the spirit of the play, even though it splits the Falstaff character, it seems to me. But this whole story of betrayal and slumming and uh, but if you for some on a more scholarly level, a real eye opener is just read the famous victories of Henry V. I mean, there you really see what Shakespeare does with the characters as compared to what people would have seen. A lot of what is in the old castle characters completely colorless. It's the prince in the famous victories, who's really the at the this who masterminds all the tricks. And Shakespeare changes quite a lot and pushes things into um, Falstaff's responsibility, which are different in the famous histories and famous victories, and then above all, this idea of the sudden change of heart and how different Shakespeare's Hal is.
Mm.
I
That's
think
brilliant. So we've got one preceding Shakespeare, the famous victories of Henry V, probably a play for the Queen's Men or something, that Shakespeare's transforming. And then we've got Shakespeare himself transformed by the filmmaker Gus Van Sant in My Own Private Idaho. So that's a lovely stretch, depending what your particular interests are. That's been a really wonderful conversation, Indira. Thank you so much for being part of our webinar. Next month is April, and we will be convening on the 7th of April. I'm going to be talking with Lauren Working about her introduction to The Tempest. And I wanted Lauren to do that play because of the work she has done, counter to the sort of historical assumption, which was that the New World made no real difference. It was quite a fringe interest in the early years of the 17th century. Lauren's work across history and literature has brought out all the ways in which London was transformed actually by the New World, and I wanted her to bring that to the play that's always been thought, but perhaps in some slightly fixed ways, to be about New World exploration, and in fact the place where we find Brave New World in the text. So I hope you'll be able to join us then. But thank you so much, Indira.